Getting back down, your eyes on your Bible, verses 5 through 7. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body have you prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Verse 7, then I said, behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book. In these verses, we recall the words of Christ, and he quoted sections from Psalm 40, verses 6 through 8. David, who wrote this, the psalmist, Jesus, David, the psalmist, Jesus, and the writer of Hebrews are all in agreement and all know that God does not desire robotic, heartless sacrifices and offerings. Again, I wonder if there's someone here today who needed to hear that. You think you can work your way to God through these check boxes, these robotic, heartless offerings that you bring before the Lord. David knew in the Old Testament when he committed adultery with Bathsheba and he had her husband murdered. In Psalm 51, he penned something along the same lines. Listen to this, 16 and 17 of Psalm 51, if you're taking notes. For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. God you will not despise. Hosea knew this too. He says he desires steadfast love, not sacrifice, the knowledge of God, rather than burnt offerings. Again, I wonder if there's someone here today who needed to hear that. Now, look back down at verses 5 through 7. You're going to see the writer of Hebrews is quoting what Christ said when he was alive and teaching. And this is what Jesus adds. He says, but a body you have prepared for me. And then in verse 7 he says, behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book. So the writer of Hebrews reminding its readers that the prophecy of the Old Testament was not only said by Jesus, but carried out by him to do God's will. Very important. Do not miss that on that verse there. And how was it carried out? It was carried out through the better sacrifice. It was carried out through the sacrifice that had substance. It was carried out through the greater sacrifice, the once for all sacrifice that the writer of Hebrews is trying to present to us. We know that Jesus became the Father's will. In Matthew 6, he even teaches us to pray, may your will be done. In Luke 22, in Gethsemane, when Jesus was praying, he said, Father, if it be your will, take this cup from me, but not my will, but what? Yours be done. Listen to this. It pleased the Son to do the Father's will, and the Father's will pleased the Son. Verses 8 and 9. When he said above, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings. These are according to the law. Then he added, behold, I have come to do your will. He does away with the first in order to establish the second. In order to establish the second. Let's talk about this for a second. He does away with the first being that God ordained sacrifice and offerings in the Old Testament for a certain time and for a certain purpose. We talked a little bit about that already. We must never downplay the purpose of the Old Covenant. Without it, we would never realize the thickness of God's grace. Without it, we would never realize the thickness of God's grace. Our dependence on him for salvation. How sinful we really are. And most importantly, as it relates to today's passage, a work that is done outside of our own efforts to accomplish the once for all sacrifice. And this had to happen, and you see it in verse 9, the end of the verse there, in order to establish the second. There would not be a second without the first, right? There would not be a vacuum cleaner without the broom, which is just not even a sand grain of an illustration for what we see here. Now let's talk about the second. We talked about the first, let's talk about the second. The second being Christ's obedience to do the will of the Father, which was done with sacrifices by being the ultimate sacrifices. Notice in verse 9, Jesus adds the words here. As he spoke, Psalm 40, behold, I have come to do your will. What was God's will? We got to wrap our arms around this. Don't let this go. Don't let this just kind of fly away like the piece of paper you put on your visor in your car, and then 3 months later you find out it's not that important, so you throw it away. You got to put your arms around this for a minute. When we remind ourselves of what God's will is, we remember that it was pretty bloody in the Old Testament. Very bloody. God demanded lives. He demanded blood. The blood carried the life. And God's will was that Christ became this once for all sacrifice. And to sweat drops of blood. And to be flogged, which means to be beaten with a lead-tipped whip or a stick in order to torture or punish somebody severely. It was bloody. They twisted the crown of thorns into his head. That was pretty bloody. They beat him with their fists, breaking his skin so that he would become bloody. Remember a little time ago, our brother Brian Andersack preached on the blood. And I'm telling you guys, with what we're studying right now in Hebrews, it would be worth going back and looking up that recording and listen to it, because it has profound benefits for what we're looking at right now. Not only was it bloody, but it was brutal. His best friend denied him 3 times. One of his so-called friends betrayed him with a kiss. And he was falsely accused of blasphemy by the chief priests and elders. It was bloody, guys. And it was brutal. It wasn't quick. It was painful. There would be no sacrifice without all of this. And then, at the end, what happened? He carried a 300-pound cross, the best he could, to a place where he would be crucified. Crucifixion, let me remind you, a method of slow and painful execution, and where the victim is either tied or nailed, we know he was nailed, which was bloody, to a large wooden beam, and then left to hang there for days or until death of exhaustion or suffocation. So why did they kill him by crucifixion? I think this goes back to what we were just reading. Jesus said, behold, I have come to do your will. Isaiah 53 would put staples into this. If you haven't read it lately, check it out. It'll get your heart ready for Holy Week coming up. But the most important thing, besides the blood, was these words that Jesus spoke from the cross. And it's 3 words that change history forever. And it puts the exclamation point on Hebrews chapter 7 through 10. And he said these 3 words, it is finished. It is finished. The cross was the Father's will, and the Son's will in that moment was to be able to establish the second that we're talking about here in Hebrews 9 and be done with the first. The once for all sacrifice put an end for all time, because Jesus said, it is finished. It is finished.
To learn more about Promise Church and to support our ministry, you can go to www.hispromisechurch.org. Thank you.